Welcome all to another Doom analysis, this time looking at the PS4 and Xbox One releases head to head and how they fare and what they differ in, and if performance is identical across both and presentation. Now, in terms of the visuals of the game, they are very impressive, and I've covered the game in detail from my PS4 First Contact, which you can check the link below or in the video, and also I've covered the multiplayer side of both versions. Again, that video is up and you can check it in the link and in the video here. But here we're looking at both versions across Xbox One and PS4 and how they differ or fare. Now, in terms of the PC release, I'll be taking a look at that across multiple versions very soon also, so please stay tuned to my channel for that. But here the PS4 and Xbox One are going under the microscope to see what differences come up on each version, and if performance is identical with its 1080-60 target, how does each of them fare? Let's commence one hell of a battle. The game itself is powered by id Tech's own id Tech 6, the latest iteration from 5, which powered Wolfenstein New Order, but here there's been a huge amount of improvements, but the 60 FPS target remains, as does the 1920 by 1080 resolution. But this is dynamic again, as it was per the previous games, and both versions do dip, but I'll cover that shortly. The list of updates and improvements to the engine are quite vast. Mega textures remain, which means you still get the same slow loading in at points. Specifically, you can see this very heavily when you're playing multiplayer and they're loading, but throughout the game where the camera moves and in the frustum range, you do get textures loading in, which is not always the most pleasing presentation on the eye, but it's not a massive problem, but you will notice it throughout play. Even if you're not susceptible to these things, it is a standout feature of the engine. Another one of those standout features is the game's anti-aliasing solution from Thiago Souza, which is TSSAA, Temporal Super Sampled Anti-Aliasing, up to 8 times. Now, this runs across both versions and on the PC, and it looks very nice indeed, although again, somebody may not like the smooth or soft look that it can give the game, because it does remove the shimmer and pixel noise throughout the whole display, and it's an absolute belter, but again, it can soften the image slightly. But some of that is down to the texture quality, but overall I'm a massive fan of it. If you throw in the absolutely incredible motion blur in this game, which is combined with the super sampled anti-aliasing to diminish the cost and obviously smooth out the frame rate, overall you will struggle to find any problems with the IQ of this game on both Xbox One, PS4 and of course the PC. I'm a massive fan of the solution. You can tell where it's come from. It definitely has that Crytek Rise look. Even the Crysis voice lives on.
Olivia is using the tower to drill a doorway into their world. You can prevent her from opening the gate.
Yes, he's still got a job. The engine treats just keep on giving though. With the post-effect suite in the game, it does have chromatic aberration, motion blur, bokeh depth of field, and you can turn off the motion blur and obviously the chromatic aberration with some of these post-effects toned down in multiplayer on both versions. The bokeh depth of field when you do the glory kills, certainly online, is where that doesn't seem to kick in. The other thing I've noticed is when you do turn on or turn off the motion blur, it does reduce the amount of scaling that's going on. But the most impressive feature of the game is its lighting and volumetric light combination, which looks superb in action. Helped immensely by its art style with a very dark and somber look to it. Very occasionally you get some bright areas, but overall it's a very subdued palette. Using burnt oranges, bright oranges, dark reds, electric blues, the mixture and the combination works impeccably well to deliver a very foreboding experience, which combines to make an absolutely beautiful looking game, even though it is a horrific one. The engine also supports GPU accelerated particle systems, which again you can see on all 3 versions, and these bounce and collide with the scenery, again arcing from lights and cables. This also comes from your grenades and weapons with guts, giblets, everything splashing over the place, alpha effects from explosions. The game is swamped with a great breadth of enemies and animation, along with a well stacked post-effect suite, including a good use of screen space reflections, which is used for objects, and obviously specular highlights and reflections of neons, combined to make a game that looks very CG in its presentation, and I'm a massive fan of it. You can also turn all these options off, so if you don't like it, you can tweak it down to nothing. The only thing you can't turn off is the anti-aliasing, but then you'd be mad too, because if you did, it would probably end up being quite a shimmery mess. I think they've succeeded in their target of being one of the best looking 60 FPS games on the market, without a doubt. Now overall, the engine is a very, very impressive one. I think id can be very proud of what they've accomplished here, and without the help of John Carmack, they have certainly gone on to bigger and greater things. This is probably the best version I've ever seen, and in this game it is such good fun to play, harking back to the old 90s days, mixing up Quake, Doom, even a little bit of Serious Sam, because the main character couldn't give a shit what's going on, he just wants to destroy everything, which makes it such fun and really refreshing to play. With all the secret sections and old versions, you can come back and play any mission as you like, including the secret areas, and you've even got challenges within the game for portals, like killing the imps here with the shotgun. I think you can already tell that I'm a big fan of the single player. Again, it's not going to win any awards for story or gameplay in terms of what it does. It's very simple, but it works, and it means you can jump in and out, and including the multiplayer, which is, again, like the actual sample we saw from the beta. It's okay, but it's not going to draw anyone, but you can check out my video to see how that works. So now that we've gone through the engine and what it presents, how does it run across both versions? Well, in terms of the resolution, like I say, both versions run a dynamic resolution, but in terms of the PS4, that seems to stick very, very solidly at a full native 1920 by 1080 more often than not. In fact, it took a hell of a lot of checks to find any point where it dropped, and the lowest I could find was 1728 by 1080. This means on PS4 the resolution only scales horizontal, with the vertical always staying at a 1080 display from all my tests. It may dip somewhere else, but I couldn't find any. And now in terms of the Xbox One, this is the other way around. It's very rarely at a 1920 by 1080 resolution, spending a lot of its time just under that, around the 900p 1600 by 900, but it can dip quite regularly under that as well when the screen gets swamped with motion blur and other effects. The lowest I could count was 1371 by 756. So this means at the best case scenario, both versions are in identical presentations, and at the worst case scenario we're looking around 22 to 44% difference between both versions. Now regularly this means that I would say on average the Xbox One is around 25 to 35% below the PS4 in terms of resolution. But as always, the number means more than it actually is. It just means that on the Xbox One you end up with a slightly softer image than the PS4, and this is obviously down to the temporal anti-aliasing solution in use here, which does soften the image overall. You don't get any extra pixel pop or shimmer, and it works reasonably well. With the game, as you can see from all my on-screen examples, is an absolute identical carbon copy on PS4 and Xbox One. Every single pixel effect, every shadow, every texture, every display is an identical carbon copy of what we see on both versions, so nobody is missing out on any effects at all. It is absolutely identical, and surprisingly enough very near what the highest setting on PC looks like, so you're not really missing out much at all, right down to the game's beautiful PBR assets and pipeline. So the only thing left to look at is the performance, and as we saw from the PS4 version on my first contact, it was a very solid game overall in the single player. From my tests, all the stressful areas, it didn't dip any lower than 54 FPS, and from my tests also, changing the FOV and dropping the motion blur to off or low, as you can see on screen with the examples, doesn't really make much difference at all. In fact, the only thing I have noticed, like I've said earlier, is if you do turn those off, you tend to get slightly less scaling or slightly lower bass than what you do when it's turned on. So really, in my opinion, use it, don't use it, doesn't really affect performance. Choose what you want to choose. But between the two there is the biggest difference, and that's not massive, but overall the PS4 is the most solid of the two. And aside this frame rate analysis, you wouldn't get to these levels, but we can see upwards of around 10 to 12 FPS at certain stressful points where the Xbox One is dropping behind the PS4. Now that's not unsurprising given the fact the parity in all of the effects and resolution and lighting going on here. They're trying to get as close as they can. But in terms of gameplay, the average is about 2.5 frames per second slower on the Xbox One, and this means that you do tend to feel slightly longer judders and frame dips. The loading sector points on the Xbox One are ever so slightly faster by 16 milliseconds, 66 versus 83 on the PS4, but you're not really going to notice that too much, and it's maybe down to the CPU boost. Whee! Win. But ultimately within the action you are going to see these bigger dips on the Xbox One, where it drop into the mid 40s, and compared to the PS4 dropping into the mid 50s, that 10 FPS can be felt throughout play. play, and it means that overall it doesn't really affect the game that much. It's not really going to hamper your enjoyment or certainly your control to a degree where you're going to throw the pad down in disgust, but if you have got the choice of both boxes, then the PS4 is the better presented and the more solid performing of the two, but the Xbox One comes a very close second. Nowhere else it can come, but it is certainly a difference in parity. You can see all the important metrics on screen, but overall it's a very solid game and it works incredibly well. id Tech have proved yet again that they know how to make an engine that performs and a game that plays really well. Bethesda have another hit on their hands here. I'm sure this will be a sleeper hit and lots of people will pick it up. I myself can wholeheartedly recommend it if you're after some rampant action. In terms of the multiplayer, I'm still not a fan, but single player wins every day, all day. And it just means after a few hours of play, you end up looking like this. Who can argue with that? As always, I hope you guys and girls enjoyed this. If you did, hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps me immensely. If you're talking about this game or anything else that I've worked on, please feel free to share it. If you didn't like it, hit it down and tell me what you didn't like. Leave all your thoughts and feedback below. And I'll see you guys and girls very soon on the next one.